My name is Tyler Johnson, and I'm 22 years old, currently a student at Northern Arizona University. What I'm about to tell you happened just 3 weeks ago, and I still can't sleep properly. I keep checking my door locks, looking over my shoulder, and jumping at every sound. You'll understand why once I tell you about something called the doorway game. I've always been a pretty normal guy. I go to classes, study in the library, hang out with friends on weekends, nothing too crazy. I grew up in Phoenix with my parents and younger sister, and they raised me to be practical and logical about everything. My dad's an accountant, my mom's a high school math teacher, and they both taught me that there's always a rational explanation for everything that happens in life. That mindset served me well growing up. When other kids were scared of monsters under their beds, I was the one explaining how shadows and imagination could trick your brain. When my friends would tell ghost stories at sleepovers, I would point out all the logical inconsistencies in their tales. I was that kid who never believed in Santa Claus because the physics of worldwide gift delivery in one night didn't make sense. My parents were proud of my critical thinking skills. They encouraged me to question everything and never accept something as true just because someone told me it was. This approach helped me excel in school, especially in science and math classes, where logical reasoning was valued. When I graduated high school, I chose to study business because it seemed practical and stable. My plan was to get my degree, find a good job with a solid company, and build a predictable, comfortable life. Nothing flashy or risky, just steady progress toward financial security and independence. I live in the dorms with my roommate Emily Rodriguez, who's completely different from me. While I'm focused on my business major and keeping my grades up, Emily spends most of her free time scrolling through TikTok and Reddit, always looking for the next weird internet trend or urban legend to obsess over. Emily is one of those people who believes that there's more to the world than what we can see and touch. She's constantly showing me videos about cryptids, ghost sightings, and conspiracy theories. She comes from a big Mexican-American family in Tucson, and she grew up hearing stories from her grandmother about spirits and supernatural encounters that supposedly happened to their relatives. Her abuela would tell stories about La Llorona, shadow people, and family members who claimed to have psychic abilities. Emily grew up believing that these stories were based on real experiences, while I learned to view them as cultural folklore and psychological phenomena. The cultural divide between Emily and me sometimes creates interesting discussions. She sees the world as full of mystery and hidden forces, while I see it as a collection of systems and processes that can be understood through observation and analysis. I've learned to tune most of Emily's paranormal interests out because I'm the type of person who needs evidence and logical explanations for everything. My parents raised me to be practical and skeptical, which has served me well in my business classes, but sometimes makes me clash with Emily's more imaginative worldview. Our dorm room is on the 3rd floor of Riley Hall, one of the older residence buildings on campus. The building was constructed in 1968, and you can tell. The walls are thin enough that you can hear conversations from neighboring rooms. The heating system is temperamental and makes weird noises all night long, and strange sounds echo through the hallways at all hours. The building has 4 floors, with about 30 rooms per floor. Our room is number 314, right at the end of a long hallway that doesn't get much foot traffic. Most students prefer rooms closer to the elevator and the community bathroom, but Emily and I specifically requested this location because it's quieter and we both need to focus on our studies. The hallway leading to our room is particularly creepy at night. There's only one light fixture that works properly, creating long shadows and areas of deep darkness. The carpet is an old, faded pattern that looks different in artificial light than it does during the day. Sometimes when I'm walking back to my room late at night, I feel like I'm moving through a completely different environment than the one I see during daylight hours. The walls of the building are covered with decades of paint, creating thick layers that have accumulated over the years. In some places, you can see where previous residents have tried to hang pictures or decorations, leaving small holes and marks that maintenance has painted over multiple times. It's the kind of place that naturally lends itself to ghost stories and urban legends, which is probably why Emily loves living there so much. She's constantly talking about the weird noises she hears at night, or the cold spots she claims to feel in certain areas of the building. I always have rational explanations for these phenomena, but she insists that there's something supernatural about our dorm. The resident advisor for our floor is this guy named Marcus Chen, who's been living in Riley Hall for 3 years. He's heard all the ghost stories and urban legends associated with the building, and he loves sharing them with new students during orientation week. According to Marcus, our building has had more reports of paranormal activity than any other residence hall on campus. Marcus is a senior studying psychology, and he's fascinated by the way urban legends spread through college communities. He's actually written papers about the psychological factors that make college students more susceptible to believing in supernatural phenomena. But even he admits that some of the stories he's heard from residents over the years are difficult to explain rationally. During our floor meetings, Marcus would sometimes share stories about previous residents who had reported strange experiences. There was the student who claimed to hear footsteps in the hallway at 3 a.m. every night for an entire semester. Another resident reported that their room would become inexplicably cold at certain times, even when the heating system was working properly. It was a Tuesday night in late October when Emily burst into our room with that excited look she gets when she's found something new online. The weather had been getting colder, and most students were starting to feel the stress of midterm exams approaching. Halloween was just a few days away, which always seemed to amplify Emily's interest in supernatural topics. I was sitting at my desk, working on an economics paper that was due the next morning. The assignment was about market fluctuations during the 1980s recession, and I was struggling to find enough credible sources to meet the minimum page requirement. Professor Martinez was notorious for being strict about citations, and she had already warned our class that she would deduct points for any sources that weren't peer-reviewed academic articles. I had been working on this paper for several hours, and my eyes were starting to strain from staring at my laptop screen. The economics department required students to write papers that were both academically rigorous and accessible to general readers, which was a difficult balance to achieve. The library databases were being slow that evening, making my research process even more frustrating. Every time I found a promising source, it would take forever to load, and half the time the link wouldn't work properly. "Tyler, you have to see this," Emily said, practically bouncing as she showed me her phone. She had just gotten back from her evening chemistry lab, and she was still wearing her safety goggles pushed up on top of her head. Her lab coat was draped over her chair, and I could smell the faint chemical odor that always clung to her clothes after experimental sessions. I found this old forum post about something called the doorway game. It's supposed to be this urban legend that started in college dorms back in the 80s. I barely looked up from my laptop. The cursor was blinking at me mockingly from a half-finished paragraph about interest rates and unemployment statistics. I had been working on this same paragraph for almost an hour, trying to find the right way to explain complex economic concepts without using too much jargon. "Emily, I really need to finish this paper. Professor Martinez doesn't accept late submissions, and this is worth 30% of my grade. I can't afford to get a bad score on this assignment." My GPA was currently sitting at 3.7, and I needed to maintain at least a 3.5 to keep my academic scholarship. The scholarship covered most of my tuition and fees, so losing it would be financially devastating for my family. My parents had made sacrifices to help me attend college, and I felt a responsibility to make the most of the opportunity. But Emily never gives up easily when she's excited about something paranormal. She sat on her bed and started reading from her phone, her voice taking on that conspiratorial tone she uses when she's trying to convince me that something supernatural is real. Listen to this. It says here that the game was first documented at universities across the Midwest in 1984. Students would perform this ritual in their dorm rooms, and weird things would start happening afterward. The post is from someone who says They were at the University of Wisconsin when the game was at its most popular. She paused and looked at me expectantly, but I was still focused on my economics paper. The recession of the early 80s had been particularly harsh, and I was trying to find specific statistics about unemployment rates in different regions. The data was scattered across multiple sources, making it difficult to create a coherent narrative. "What kind of weird things?" I asked, still typing but getting slightly curious despite myself. Emily has a way of drawing me into her stories even when I'm trying to focus on something else. Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. Even though we were alone in our room with the door closed, people reported feeling watched, hearing footsteps in their rooms at night, finding wet footprints on their floors in the morning. Some students even claimed they were being followed around campus by someone they could never quite see clearly. I stopped typing and turned around in my chair to look at her. "Come on, Emily. You don't actually believe this stuff, do you? It sounds like the kind of creepypasta that gets posted on Reddit to freak out gullible college students." Emily shrugged and scrolled through more of the forum posts on her phone. The screen was bright in our dimly lit room, and I could see the reflection of text in her eyes as she read. "I don't know. But look at all these testimonials. There are dozens of people on different forums talking about their experiences with the doorway game. They can't all be making it up, can they? They absolutely can all be making it up. That's how internet legends work, Emily. One person posts a fake story, then others copy it and add their own details to make it seem more credible. Before you know it, you have hundreds of people claiming they experienced the same fictional event. I had seen this phenomenon before with other internet urban legends. Someone would post a creative writing exercise as if it were a true story, and then copycat posts would start appearing across different platforms. Eventually, the story would become so widespread that people would start believing it was based on real events. The internet had made it incredibly easy for fictional stories to spread and gain credibility through repetition. Social media algorithms actually encouraged this kind of viral sharing because controversial or frightening content generated more engagement than mundane posts. Emily rolled her eyes at me, a gesture I had become very familiar with during our months as roommates. "You're so skeptical about everything, Tyler. Don't you ever want to experience something unexplained? Something that might make you question what's really possible in this world?" The truth was, my life had been feeling pretty monotonous lately. Same classes, same routine, same predictable days blending into each other like a boring movie stuck on repeat. I wake up at 7 a.m. every morning, shower in the communal bathroom down the hall, eat breakfast in the dining hall, attend my classes, study in the library, do homework, and go to bed. My schedule was so rigid that other students on our floor had started joking about being able to set their watches by my daily routine. I would pass the same people in the hallways at the same times every day, eat at the same table in the dining hall, and study in the same corner of the library. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I had business ethics at 8 a.m., followed by macroeconomics at 10 a.m. Tuesdays and Thursdays were dedicated to my accounting classes and a psychology elective that I was taking to fulfill my general education requirement. The psychology class had been interesting at first, but even that had become routine. We covered basic concepts like conditioning, memory formation, and cognitive biases, nothing that challenged my fundamental understanding of how the world worked. Maybe part of me was curious about doing something different, even if it was just proving Emily wrong about another one of her paranormal obsessions. I had successfully debunked her theories about the supposedly haunted elevator in our building, which turned out to have a mechanical problem that caused it to stop between floors occasionally. I had also explained away the mysterious cold spots she claimed to feel in the library basement, which were actually caused by poorly insulated windows and an inadequate heating system. The building's HVAC system was old and inefficient, creating temperature variations that Emily interpreted as supernatural phenomena. Adding the doorway game to my list of disproven supernatural phenomena might actually be satisfying, and it would give me something to tease Emily about for the rest of the semester. Fine, I said, saving my economics paper and closing my laptop. What exactly is this game supposed to involve? And please don't tell me it requires us to summon demons or sacrifice small animals. Emily's face lit up immediately, and she started reading from her phone again with renewed enthusiasm. Okay, so the rules are very specific, and according to multiple sources, you have to follow them exactly or the game won't work. You have to do it at exactly 3 a.m. because that's when the barrier between our world and others is supposedly thinnest. That already sounds stupid, I interrupted. The barrier between worlds? Emily, you're talking like parallel dimensions are real. Just listen, Emily continued, ignoring my skepticism. You turn off all the lights in your room and make sure only one door is open. Most people use their bathroom door because it leads to a smaller enclosed space, which apparently makes it easier for entities to manifest. Entities to manifest, I repeated. Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds? You're talking about this like it's a science experiment. Emily shot me an annoyed look. Do you want to hear the rules or not? Because I can just do this by myself if you're going to be sarcastic the whole time. Sorry, continue. I promise I'll try to keep my commentary to myself. You place a full glass of water on the threshold of the open door. The water has to be clean and fresh. Not from the tap, if you can help it. Bottled water is supposed to work better because it's purer and hasn't been treated with chemicals. Of course it is, I muttered under my breath. Emily glared at me. The water serves as both an offering and a test. If something comes through the doorway, it will drink the water. That's how you know the ritual worked. She continued reading from her phone. Then, right before you go to bed, you have to whisper the phrase, "If you enter, I'll see you 3 times while looking toward the open doorway." The repetition is important because it supposedly strengthens the invitation. And then, what happens? Emily's expression became more serious as she scrolled through additional forum posts. According to the accounts I've read, if something actually comes through that doorway during the night, it will drink the water. And if you wake up and the glass is empty, that means whatever came through saw you sleeping. Once it's seen you, it becomes attached to you. She paused to let that information sink in before continuing. It will start following you, watching you, showing up in places where you should be alone. People describe feeling constantly observed, hearing footsteps that match their pace when they're walking, seeing movement in their peripheral vision. I laughed, but it came out more nervous than I intended. So let me get this straight. Some invisible entity is going to sneak into our room, drink a glass of water like it's at a supernatural rest stop, and then become my personal stalker? I know it sounds crazy when you put it like that, but Tyler, there are so many detailed accounts. People describe the same experiences over and over again. Feeling watched in empty rooms, hearing footsteps that match their own pace when they're walking alone, seeing shadows move in their peripheral vision. Emily started reading some of the forum posts aloud to convince me. This one is from a guy named Marcus, who was at Ohio State in 2007. He says, and I quote, "After I played the doorway game, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always just behind me. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could sense their presence. It lasted for almost 2 months before it finally stopped." End quote. She scrolled to another post. Here's one from a girl named Jennifer at Penn State. Quote, "The thing that scared me the most wasn't the empty glass or the wet footprints. It was how the presence seemed to learn my schedule. I would feel it most strongly in places where I spent a lot of time alone, like my favorite study spot in the library or the laundry room in my dorm. It was like it was adapting to my habits." End quote. Emily continued reading testimonials, each one more detailed and unsettling than the last. This person says they started leaving digital recordings in their room at night, and when they played them back, they could hear what sounded like breathing and movement, even though they were alone. Another account mentions that the presence seemed to be strongest during times of stress or emotional vulnerability. This person was going through a difficult breakup when they played the game, and they felt like the entity was somehow feeding off their negative emotions. Or, I said, people are really good at psyching themselves out after performing a creepy ritual in the dark. The human brain is incredibly susceptible to suggestion, especially when you're already primed to expect something supernatural to happen. I had learned about this phenomenon in my psychology elective. When people expect to experience something unusual, their brains will often interpret normal sensory input as evidence of the expected phenomenon. It's the same reason why people report seeing ghosts in supposedly haunted locations, or why they experience medical symptoms after being told they've been exposed to a harmless substance. The placebo effect was incredibly powerful, and it could work in reverse as well. If people believed that something negative was going to happen to them, they would often experience symptoms or phenomena that seemed to confirm their fears. Emily was quiet for a moment, and I thought I had successfully talked her out of trying the game. But then she looked at me with a challenge in her eyes, the same look she gets when she's determined to prove a point. Okay, if you're so sure it's all fake, then you won't mind proving it. Let's do the doorway game tonight. Emily, I have class tomorrow morning. Professor Martinez's business ethics class is at 8 a.m., and I can't afford to be exhausted during the midterm review. So do I. I have organic chemistry at 7:30, which is way worse than your business class. Dr. Peterson expects us to memorize molecular structures and reaction mechanisms, and I need to be sharp to keep up. She had a point about her chemistry class being more demanding than my business course. Emily was pre-med, and her course load was significantly more challenging than mine. She was taking 18 credit hours this semester, including advanced chemistry, biology, and calculus classes. Her organic chemistry class was particularly notorious for being difficult. Dr. Peterson was known for giving pop quizzes and expecting students to solve complex problems under time pressure. The class had a reputation for weeding out pre-med students who weren't serious about their commitment to medical school. If she was willing to risk being tired for her chemistry exam, then maybe I was being overly cautious about my business ethics review. It'll only take a few minutes to set up, and then we just go to sleep like normal? Emily continued. If nothing happens, you get to say you told me so forever. But if something does happen, nothing is going to happen. Then you have nothing to worry about. I stared at her for a long moment, weighing the pros and cons of participating in her paranormal experiment. The reasonable part of my brain was telling me this was a waste of time, that I should focus on my paper and get some sleep. But there was another part of me, a part I didn't usually listen to, that was curious about what we might experience. Not because I believed in the supernatural, but because I was interested in the psychology of it all. How would our minds react to deliberately putting ourselves in a creepy situation? Would we experience the placebo effect of supernatural phenomena just because we were expecting it? The scientific part of me was intrigued by the opportunity to observe our own psychological reactions to a controlled, scary situation. It would be like conducting an informal experiment on the power of suggestion and expectation. Fine, I said finally, but when nothing happens, you have to promise me you'll stop reading these paranormal forums and focus on your midterms. We're both supposed to be studying for finals, not chasing ghost stories. Deal, Emily said immediately. But when something does happen, you have to admit that there are things in this world that can't be explained by textbooks and logic. We shook hands on it, and Emily immediately started preparing for the ritual with an enthusiasm that made me question whether I had made the right decision. We spent the next hour finishing our homework and getting ready for bed. Emily continued researching the doorway game on her laptop, reading me additional details and testimonials that she found across different websites and forums. The more she read, the more elaborate the mythology around the game became. According to her research, the doorway game had supposedly originated in the early 1980s at a small college in Wisconsin. A group of students in the psychology department had been experimenting with different ways to induce paranormal experiences, and one of them had developed the ritual as a way to invite supernatural entities into our physical world. Listen to this, Emily said. reading from a particularly detailed forum post. This person claims that the original version of the game was developed by a graduate student who was studying altered states of consciousness. He was trying to create a controlled environment where people could experience supernatural phenomena without using drugs or other dangerous methods. That sounds like something a graduate student would do, I admitted. Psychology departments are always conducting weird experiments. The original version of the game had been more complex, involving candles, specific types of wood for the threshold, and multiple participants. But over the years, as the story spread from campus to campus, the rules had been simplified and streamlined. The version that Emily had found online was supposedly the most effective iteration, refined through decades of experimentation by college students across the country. Here's another interesting thing, Emily said, scrolling through more forum posts. Several people mentioned that the game works better in older buildings, especially ones that have a lot of history. They think that places with strong emotional imprints are more susceptible to supernatural activity. Well, Riley Hall definitely fits that description. I said, this place has been housing college students for over 50 years. If emotional imprints were real, this building would be saturated with them. I was being sarcastic, but Emily took my comment seriously. That's exactly what I was thinking. Plus, our room is at the end of the hall, which means it's more isolated and has fewer people walking past it regularly. According to these posts, isolation makes the ritual more effective. As we continued reading about the doorway game, I started to notice patterns in the testimonials that people had posted. Most of the accounts followed a similar structure: initial skepticism, decision to try the game as a joke or dare, successful completion of the ritual, followed by weeks or months of feeling followed and watched. The experiences described were remarkably consistent across different forums and time periods. People reported the same types of phenomena: feeling watched in empty spaces, hearing footsteps that matched their movements, seeing shadows in their peripheral vision. But there were also accounts from people who said nothing had happened when they tried the game. These negative results were less detailed and usually much shorter, often just a sentence or two saying that the ritual hadn't worked for them. Have you noticed that the negative accounts are all really short? I asked Emily. It's almost like people don't want to spend time writing about their boring, non-supernatural experiences. Or maybe the people who didn't experience anything just didn't have the right mindset for it, Emily suggested. Some of these posts mention that you have to be genuinely open to the possibility of supernatural contact for the game to work. That sounds like a convenient excuse for why the ritual might fail. If nothing happens, it's not because the game is fake, it's because the person wasn't believing hard enough. Emily considered this. Maybe. But it also makes sense from a psychological perspective. If you're completely closed off to the possibility of experiencing something unusual, you might dismiss subtle phenomena that someone else would notice. As 3 a.m. approached, I found myself getting more nervous than I expected. It wasn't that I believed anything supernatural would happen, but there was something unsettling about deliberately setting up a scenario designed to invite unknown entities into our personal space. The building was quieter than usual at this time of night. Most students were either asleep or studying in the 24-hour study lounges on the first floor. Occasionally, we would hear footsteps in the hallway or the sound of someone using the bathroom. But for the most part, our floor was silent. The silence had a quality to it that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the absence of noise, but something deeper and more profound. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Emily had already filled a tall glass with water from our mini fridge. She had insisted on using bottled water instead of tap water, following the instructions she had found online. Our dorm room was small, with 2 twin beds, 2 desks, and a bathroom that we shared. The bathroom had a door that connected directly to our main room, and that was the doorway we decided to use for the game. The room felt different in the darkness as we prepared for the ritual. Shadows seemed deeper than usual, and familiar objects took on strange shapes that my eyes couldn't quite resolve. The bathroom doorway which I had walked through hundreds of times without thinking, now seemed ominous and uninviting. At 2:58 a.m., I turned off all the lights, while Emily placed the glass of water right on the threshold between our room and the bathroom. The water looked strange in the darkness, catching what little light filtered in from the hallway under our main door. "Okay," Emily whispered. "Now we both have to say the phrase while looking at the bathroom doorway." We stood side by side, staring into the black opening of the bathroom. I could barely make out the outline of the sink and mirror in the darkness beyond. The space seemed to extend further than it should, as if the darkness was somehow deeper than the actual dimensions of the room. "If you enter, I'll see you," we whispered together. The words felt strange in my mouth, heavier than normal speech. There was something about speaking into the darkness that made every syllable seem significant and loaded with meaning. We repeated it 2 more times, and each time, the words felt heavier in the air around us. Maybe it was just the power of suggestion, but the bathroom doorway seemed to grow darker with each repetition, as if something was absorbing the light around it. "If you enter, I'll see you. If you enter, I'll see you." After the 3rd time, we stood there for a moment in complete silence. I realized I was holding my breath, listening for any sound from the bathroom or the hallway outside our room. But everything was quiet, except for the distant hum of the building's heating system and the occasional sound of footsteps from other floors. "Well," I whispered, "that was appropriately creepy. Now can we go to bed?" Emily nodded, and we carefully made our way to our beds in the darkness. I didn't want to risk stepping on the glass of water, so I walked along the far wall to reach my bed. As I settled under my blankets, I kept glancing toward the bathroom doorway. It was just a rectangular patch of deeper darkness now, but something about it felt different than it had before we performed the ritual. I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep, telling myself that my nervousness was completely psychological. We had essentially hypnotized ourselves into feeling scared through the power of suggestion and atmosphere. In the morning, the water would still be in the glass, and we would both realize how silly we had been, but falling asleep proved more difficult than usual. Every small sound in the building seemed amplified and potentially significant. I could hear Emily shifting in her bed across the room, the settling of pipes in the walls, footsteps from students walking down the hallway outside our door. Normal sounds that I usually filtered out unconsciously now seemed loaded with meaning and potentially threatening. The heating system would click on and off every few minutes, creating metallic sounds that echoed through the walls. Somewhere above us, another student was apparently having trouble sleeping because I could hear them walking around their room repeatedly. The old building creaked and settled around us like a living thing, its wooden frame expanding and contracting with temperature changes. I tried to use relaxation techniques that I had learned in a stress management workshop the previous semester. I focused on controlling my breathing, letting each exhale release some of the tension in my muscles. I counted backwards from 100, trying to clear my mind of anxious thoughts and drift naturally into sleep. But every time I started to drift off, some small sound would snap me back to alertness. A door closing somewhere in the building, voices in the hallway, the elevator machinery humming to life. It was as if my subconscious mind was refusing to let me sleep, keeping me alert for any sign that something unusual was happening. I must have eventually drifted off, because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly in complete darkness. According to my phone, it was 4:37 a.m. Something had pulled me out of sleep, but I couldn't immediately identify what it was. I lay still, listening to the silence around me. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, like water dripping slowly onto the floor. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the direction of the bathroom doorway. My first thought was that maybe the glass had been knocked over somehow, and water was spilling onto the floor. But as I listened more carefully, the sound didn't seem quite right for spilled water. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The dripping continued at perfectly regular intervals, about one drop every 3 seconds. It had the quality of water falling from a significant height, like from a leaky faucet or a wet ceiling. But our bathroom faucet didn't leak. and there had been no sign of water damage in the ceiling. I reached for my phone to use its flashlight, but then I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to see what was making that sound. What if there really was something there that shouldn't be? What if turning on the light would reveal that Emily's paranormal theories were actually correct? Instead, I lay there in the darkness, listening to the steady dripping and trying to come up with rational explanations. Maybe there was a leak in the bathroom ceiling that had just started. Maybe the glass had developed a hairline crack and was slowly leaking water. Maybe Emily had gotten up to use the bathroom and accidentally knocked the glass with her foot. But Emily's breathing from across the room was deep and steady. She was clearly still asleep, and had been for hours based on the rhythm of her breathing. The sound wasn't coming from her side of the room anyway. It was definitely originating from the bathroom doorway area. The dripping continued for several more minutes, and then it gradually stopped. The silence that followed seemed even deeper than before, as if the normal ambient sounds of the building had been muffled somehow. I waited in the darkness, straining my ears for any other sounds, but everything had gone quiet again. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my nervousness, and I fell back asleep. But my dreams were filled with strange images of dark doorways and shadowy figures moving just outside my field of vision. When my alarm went off at 7 a.m., the first thing I did was look toward the bathroom doorway. In the morning light filtering through our window, I could see that something was different. The glass was still there, sitting exactly where we had placed it the night before. But even from across the room, I could tell it looked empty. I got out of bed and walked over to investigate. The glass was sitting upright on the threshold, positioned perfectly, but it was now completely empty. Not a single drop of water remained inside. The glass was bone dry, as if it had never contained water at all. "Emily," I called out, shaking her shoulder gently. "Emily, wake up." She groaned and rolled over, pulling her pillow over her head. "What time is it? Please tell me it's not time for chemistry class yet." 7 a.m. "Look at the glass." Emily sat up and immediately focused on the bathroom doorway. When she saw the empty glass, her eyes went wide, and she was suddenly completely awake. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Tyler, the water is gone." "I know. I can see that." This means something actually came through the doorway last night. Something drank the water. I picked up the empty glass and examined it carefully. There were no cracks or damage that would explain a leak. The glass was completely intact and clean, with no residue or stains inside. There has to be a logical explanation. Maybe the water evaporated. In 6 hours, Tyler, that was 8 full ounces of water. Water doesn't evaporate that quickly unless it's being heated, and it's not exactly warm in here. She had a point, but I wasn't ready to accept a supernatural explanation. Our dorm room was typically cool at night, especially during late October. The heating system in the building was inconsistent, and our room was often colder than comfortable. Conditions that would slow evaporation, not accelerate it. Maybe you got up during the night and drank it without remembering. Sometimes people do things while they're half asleep. I didn't get up at all last night. I slept straight through until you woke me up just now. And even if I had gotten up, why would I drink water from a glass on the floor when we have bottles of water right here on our nightstand? I was about to respond when something else caught my attention. There were marks on the floor near the doorway that I hadn't noticed before. I knelt down to get a better look. "Emily, come look at this." The marks looked like footprints, but they were strange. They appeared to be made of water or some other liquid, and they had a muddy, dirty quality to them, as if someone had been walking through wet soil. The prints were roughly the size of adult human feet, but they had an odd quality that I couldn't quite identify. Emily knelt beside me and examined the footprints more closely. "These look fresh," she said quietly, "and look at the pattern they make." The prints started right at the threshold where we had placed the glass and led into our room. But what made my blood run cold was where they went. The wet, muddy footprints walked directly to my bed. They stopped right beside where my head had been resting while I slept, as if something had stood there watching me for an extended period. Then they turned and walked back toward the bathroom doorway, But instead of stopping there, they continued past the bathroom and went to our main room door. The final footprint was right at the base of our door, as if whatever had made them had left our room and gone out into the hallway. Emily was staring at the footprints with her mouth open. "Tyler, something was in our room last night. Something stood right next to your bed while you were sleeping." I stood up slowly, my heart pounding as I tried to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind was scrambling for explanations. Maybe the footprints were already there, and we just hadn't noticed them in the darkness. Maybe they were from maintenance workers or cleaning staff who had been in our room earlier. But even as I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, I knew they didn't make sense. The footprints were clearly fresh, still slightly damp in some places, and they followed a path that was too specific to be coincidental. Something had entered through the bathroom doorway, approached my bed, and then left through our main door. The footprints were also distinctly different from normal human footprints. They were slightly elongated, and there was something about the toe impressions that didn't look quite right. The mud or dirt that composed them had an unusual texture, almost like it was mixed with something else that I couldn't identify. "We need to clean this up," I said, my voice shakier than I intended. "And we're never doing anything like this again." Emily nodded quickly, but I could see the excitement in her eyes despite her fear. Part of her was thrilled that the doorway game had apparently worked exactly as advertised. "Tyler, this is incredible. We actually made contact with something from another dimension." "We don't know that," I said firmly. "There could still be a rational explanation for all of this." "What rational explanation? Someone broke into our room, drank our water, walked around leaving muddy footprints, and then left without disturbing anything else? Why would anyone do that?" I didn't have a good answer for that question. We spent the next hour scrubbing the footprints off our floor and trying to return our room to normal. The marks came up easily with soap and water, but they left behind a faint stain on the carpet that we couldn't completely eliminate. Even after the physical evidence was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The room felt different somehow, as if an invisible presence had altered the atmosphere just by passing through it. Over the next few days, I tried to push the incident out of my mind and focus on my classes. I told myself that there was a rational explanation for what had happened, even if I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe it had been an elaborate prank by someone else in our dorm. Maybe Emily had staged the whole thing to convince me that the paranormal was real. But then, I started noticing other things. When I walked to class, I began to feel like someone was following me. Not obviously, but in my peripheral vision, I would catch glimpses of movement that seemed to match my pace. When I would turn to look, there would be nothing there, or just other students going about their normal business. The feeling was strongest when I was walking alone between buildings. The campus had several wooded areas and quiet paths that I used as shortcuts, and these places began to feel uncomfortable in a way they never had before. It was as if there was always someone just behind me, matching my footsteps so perfectly that I couldn't hear them over the sound of my own movement. The sensation would start as soon as I left my dorm building each morning. I would step outside and immediately feel watched, as if invisible eyes were tracking my every move. When I walked across the quad to my first class, I would find myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, expecting to see someone following me. The campus quad was a large, open space surrounded by academic buildings and residence halls. During the day, it was usually filled with students walking between classes, studying under trees, or playing frisbee. But even in these crowded areas, I felt isolated and observed. In the library, I started choosing seats that put my back against a wall, because I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was standing behind me. Even in crowded areas, I felt isolated, as if there was an invisible presence near me that other people couldn't detect. The sensation was particularly strong in quiet study areas. I would be reading or working on assignments, completely focused on my work, when suddenly I would feel watched. Not the casual feeling of someone glancing in my direction, but the intense, focused attention of someone staring directly at me. I would look up and scan the area around me, but I never saw anyone paying me any particular attention. Other students would be reading, typing on their laptops, or quietly discussing their assignments. Nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being observed would persist. The library had several floors, each with different atmospheres and noise levels. The ground floor was social and collaborative, while the upper floors became progressively quieter and more focused on individual study. I found myself avoiding the upper floors because the sense of being watched was strongest in those isolated areas. The worst part was in our dorm room. Every night, I would lie in bed, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Sometimes I would hear what sounded like footsteps in our room, even though Emily was asleep and I wasn't moving. The footsteps always seemed to approach my bed and then stop, as if someone was standing there watching me. The sound was subtle, more like a shift in air pressure than actual footsteps, but it was consistent. It would happen at roughly the same time each night, usually between 2 and 3 a.m. I would be lying there, either trying to fall asleep or drifting in and out of consciousness, when I would become aware of a presence moving through our room. I started sleeping with my phone's flashlight app, ready to activate instantly, but whenever I heard the footsteps and turned on the light, the room would be empty. Just Emily, sleeping peacefully in her bed, and nothing else out of place. After a week of this, I was exhausted and on edge constantly. My grades started slipping because I couldn't concentrate in class. I was jumping at shadows and startling other students with my nervous behavior. My friends began to notice that something was wrong with me. "Dude, you look terrible," said my friend Marcus after our macroeconomics class. "Are you getting any sleep? You've got dark circles under your eyes like you've been up for days." Marcus was a junior who lived in a different dorm, and we had become friends through our shared business classes. He was usually pretty observant about people's moods and behaviors, so his concern was both genuine and warranted. "I'm fine," I told him, "just stressed about midterms." But I wasn't fine, and Marcus could tell. "Man, midterm stress doesn't make you jump every time someone walks behind you. You've been acting paranoid all week. What's really going on?" I considered telling him about the doorway game and what had been happening since then, but I knew how crazy it would sound. Marcus was even more skeptical about paranormal phenomena than I usually was, and he would probably think I was having some kind of mental breakdown. "I've just been having trouble sleeping," I said finally. "Sometimes when you're sleep deprived, everything feels more intense and scary than it actually is." Marcus nodded, but he still looked concerned. "Maybe you should talk to someone at the counseling center. They have services specifically for students who are dealing with stress and anxiety." The constant feeling of being watched and followed was wearing me down psychologically. I found myself avoiding certain areas of campus where the sensation was strongest, which meant taking longer routes to get to my classes and missing some of my usual study spots. The campus coffee shop, where I used to go between classes to read and relax, became uncomfortable because I felt too exposed sitting at the small tables. The quiet sections of the library, which had always been my favorite places to study, now felt threatening and isolated. Emily noticed the change in me, but when she asked about it, I didn't know how to explain what I was experiencing without sounding crazy. How do you tell someone that you think an invisible entity is following you around because of a stupid game you played? "Tyler, you've been acting really strange lately," Emily said one evening as we were both working on homework in our room. "You keep looking over your shoulder, and you've been jumping every time someone knocks on our door. What's going on?" I looked up from my business ethics textbook, which I had been staring at for the past hour without absorbing any of the information. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've been feeling really anxious since we played that game. I keep thinking someone is watching me or following me around." Emily's expression became serious. "You think it's connected to the doorway game?" I don't know what to think. Logically, I know that what we experienced probably has a rational explanation, but emotionally, I can't shake the feeling that something changed that night. Emily had been researching the doorway game ever since our experience with it. She had found additional forums and websites dedicated to supernatural experiences, and she had been documenting accounts from other people who claimed to have played the game. "Tyler, I think I know what's happening to you," she said quietly, showing me her laptop screen. "I've been reading more about the doorway game, and there are accounts from people who experienced exactly what you're going through right now." "What do you mean?" "The feeling of being followed. The sense that someone is watching you. Hearing footsteps in your room at night." According to these forum posts, those are all common experiences reported by people who successfully completed the game. She showed me several detailed accounts from different forums. The experiences described were remarkably similar to what I had been going through, down to specific details about feeling watched in quiet places and hearing unexplained footsteps at night. "Successfully completed it?" Emily's expression was grim. "The empty glass means that something did come through the doorway that night. And once it's seen you, it forms a connection with you. People describe it as having a shadow that follows them everywhere they go." I laughed, but it came out hollow and strained. "Emily, you're talking about this like it's real, like there's actually some kind of invisible creature stalking me. What if there is? That's impossible." "Is it? Think about everything that's happened since we played the game. The empty glass, the footprints, the way you've been feeling followed everywhere you go. What if the impossible is actually possible?" I wanted to argue with her, to insist that there was a rational explanation for everything. But I was tired of being afraid all the time. I was tired of feeling watched and followed and never being able to prove that something was actually there. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's say you're right. Let's say there really is something following me around because of that stupid game. What am I supposed to do about it?" Emily had clearly been thinking about this question. She showed me several forum posts from people who had dealt with similar experiences. Most of the people who posted about their experiences said that the presence eventually faded away after a few weeks or months. It's like whatever came through the doorway gets bored and moves on to something else. A few weeks or months? "Emily, I can't live like this for months. I'm already falling behind in my classes, and I feel like I'm losing my mind." "There might be another option," she said hesitantly. "Some people mention trying to communicate with their shadow directly, not in a spiritual or mystical way, but more like acknowledging its presence and setting boundaries." She showed me a forum post from someone who had experienced a similar situation. This person says that once they started acknowledging the presence and setting clear boundaries, the intensity of the experiences decreased significantly. They were able to coexist with their shadow rather than being terrorized by it. "You want me to try talking to my invisible stalker?" I know how it sounds, but think about it logically. If there really is something there, pretending it doesn't exist isn't working. Maybe acknowledging it will help you regain some control over the situation. That night, after Emily had gone to sleep, I lay in my bed, listening to the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. They moved through our room with the same pattern they had followed for the past week and a half, eventually stopping right beside my bed. Instead of lying there in fear, I took a deep breath and spoke quietly into the darkness. "I know you're there," I whispered. "I don't know what you are or what you want, but you need to understand that this is my space. You can't keep following me around like this. It's affecting my life, my sleep, my ability to function." The room was silent for a long moment. Then I heard something I had never heard before. It sounded like a response, but not in the form of words. It was more like a shift in the air around me, a change in the quality of the silence. "If you're here because of the game we played, then I acknowledge that," I continued. "But I need you to respect my boundaries. You can't keep making me feel afraid in my own room. This is where I live, where I study, where I sleep. I need to feel safe here." What happened next was subtle, but unmistakable. The oppressive feeling of being watched, which had been constant for days, suddenly lessened. Not completely, but noticeably. It was like a weight had been lifted partially off my chest. I waited for several more minutes, listening carefully, but I didn't hear any more footsteps that night. For the first time in over a week, I fell asleep without feeling like someone was standing over my bed. The next few days were different. I still occasionally felt the sensation of being followed, but it was less intense and less constant. Instead of feeling like a frightening presence was stalking me, it was more like having a shadow that kept its distance, but remained aware of my movements. I started thinking of it less as a threatening entity and more like an unwanted companion that had attached itself to me through the ritual. Not friendly, but not actively malicious either, just there, existing in the peripheral spaces of my awareness. Emily noticed the change in my demeanor almost immediately. "You seem less on edge," she observed, after I had managed to sit through an entire lecture without constantly looking over my shoulder. "I think you were right about acknowledging it," I told her. "I'm not saying I completely understand what's happening, but talking to whatever is there seemed to help establish some kind of boundaries." "So you really believe now that something supernatural is following you around?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. I believe that our experience with the doorway game caused something to happen that I can't fully explain through conventional logic. Whether that something is supernatural, psychological, or some combination of both, I don't know. But I do know that pretending it wasn't real wasn't helping me deal with it. Over the following weeks, I learned to coexist with whatever presence had attached itself to me. It was always there, a constant but manageable awareness at the edge of my consciousness. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, or feel a sudden temperature change in an empty room, but these experiences became less frightening and more like reminders of an unusual reality I had accidentally stumbled into. I developed a routine for managing the presence. Each night before bed, I would acknowledge it quietly and reaffirm the boundaries we had established. I would remind it that while I accepted its existence, I needed space to live my normal life without constant fear or distraction. The presence seemed to respect these boundaries most of the time. It still followed me around campus, but it kept its distance and rarely made itself known in ways that interfered with my daily activities. It was like having a quiet roommate who preferred to remain invisible. Emily continued researching supernatural phenomena, but she focused more on understanding what we had experienced rather than seeking out new paranormal adventures. She found additional accounts from people who had played the doorway game and learned to live with the consequences. "There's this theory," she told me one evening, "that certain rituals don't actually summon supernatural entities from other dimensions. Instead, they make us more sensitive to phenomena that are already present in our environment all the time." "What do you mean?" Think about it. What if there are always invisible presences around us, but most people are too focused on the physical world to notice them? What if the doorway game doesn't bring something new into your life, but just makes you aware of something that was already there? It was an interesting idea, and it made me think about all the times I had felt inexplicably uncomfortable in certain locations, or had the sensation of being watched when I was alone. Maybe those experiences hadn't been psychological after all. Maybe I had always been sensitive to these invisible presences, but the ritual had amplified that sensitivity. 3 weeks after we played the doorway game, I had mostly adjusted to my new reality. The presence was still there, still following me around like an invisible companion, but it had become part of my normal experience, rather than a source of constant anxiety. I still don't recommend that anyone try the doorway game, whether what happened to me was psychological or genuinely paranormal. The experience was disturbing and disruptive enough that I wouldn't wish it on anyone else. Some games aren't worth playing, no matter how curious you might be about their outcomes. But if you ever find yourself in a situation where you've invited something unknown into your life, remember that you have more power than you might think. You can set boundaries, you can demand respect, and sometimes, acknowledging the presence of something you don't understand is the first step toward learning to live with it. Emily and I never spoke about playing the game again, but sometimes I catch her looking at me with a mixture of fascination and concern, as if she's trying to see the invisible presence that she helped me attract. She knows it's still there, still following me around, and I think part of her wishes she could experience it directly rather than just hearing about it secondhand. As for me, I've learned that the world is stranger and more complex than I previously believed. I'm not ready to fully embrace the supernatural, but I'm no longer completely closed off to possibilities that exist outside my textbooks and lectures. The presence has become a constant reminder that there are aspects of reality that can't be easily categorized or explained. It's taught me to be more humble about the limits of human knowledge and more open to experiences that don't fit neatly into conventional frameworks. Just make sure your door is locked tonight. You never know what might be waiting in the darkness beyond your threshold, watching and waiting for an invitation to step into your world.